Christmas was just days away. The city center was glowing with lights, streets packed with last-minute shoppers rushing through the festive chaos. The headquarters of one of Northern Ireland's largest banks, right in the heart of Belfast, was preparing for one of its busiest periods of the year. But nobody saw the storm coming. Not until the morning of December 20th, 2004, when it became clear that the largest bank robbery in United Kingdom history had just taken place. Because when the vault was opened that morning, it was almost completely empty. A heist of this scale wasn't some spur-of-the-moment act of courage. It was clearly the product of long, meticulous planning. The gang behind it had almost certainly spent months in preparation, carefully studying the Northern Bank's headquarters on Donegal Square West. Back then, the Northern Bank was one of the biggest financial institutions in Northern Ireland, and in the weeks leading up to Christmas, it kept extra cash in its vaults. The robbers had studied the bank's security routines and vulnerabilities in precise detail, specifically which employees had access to the vault, what their shift schedules looked like, and even details about their personal lives. Fake police uniforms had been obtained, dedicated mobile phones had been prepared for communication, getaway vehicles and escape routes had all been mapped out in advance. By the time the evening of the robbery arrived, every member of the gang knew their role. Every step had been memorized. And so, on the evening of Sunday, December 19th, 2004, a nightmare began for two families living in different parts of Belfast. The first target was the home of bank employee Chris Ward, who lived in Downpatrick, a quiet town to the south of the city. That evening, men appeared at the Ward family's door and introduced themselves as police officers. All it took was for the door to open. The moment it did, armed men dressed in fake police uniforms forced their way inside and overpowered Chris. His family was gathered into one room at gunpoint and held there as hostages, while the young bank clerk was handcuffed right in front of his loved ones and dragged out of his own home by masked attackers. Some of the gang stayed behind to keep the family under threat. Meanwhile, the second target was the home of Kevin McMullen and his wife Karen, who lived in the Polglass area to the west of the city center. Kevin was a senior cashier at the bank, an experienced banker who oversaw the vault operations and who also happened to be Chris Ward's direct supervisor. Both men worked in the cash handling department. Of course, when the McMullens heard a knock at their door that Sunday night, they assumed it was the police and opened it without hesitation. But the people standing there were the other members of the gang. Within moments, Kevin had been overpowered and restrained. The robbers had no interest in the valuables in the house. Their real target was the man who held the keys to the vault. Karen McMullen was then dragged out of her own home, blindfolded, and taken to an unknown location. Her husband lay bound on the floor of his house, writhing in terror, with no idea what was happening to his wife. With two bank employees and their families now under their control, the gang brought Chris Ward from Downpatrick to Kevin McMullen's house. Two colleagues found themselves together under the most horrifying of circumstances. Both of their families were in the hands of criminals, and both of them were prisoners. The masked attackers delivered their instructions with brutal clarity. Tomorrow morning, you will go to work as normal. You will act as if nothing has happened. If you don't, your families die. Under those chilling threats, a long and sleepless night began for both men. Karen McMullen spent that time blindfolded and held captive in an unknown location, trapped in darkness and uncertainty for nearly 24 hours. The Ward family, back in Downpatrick, remained held at gunpoint in their own home, waiting in helpless fear until morning. Finally, as Belfast woke up on the morning of Monday, December 20th, around 6 a.m., the gang moved into the next phase of their plan. Before leaving Kevin's house, the attackers issued one final round of threats. Go to work, act normal, follow every instruction to the letter. Karen was already in their hands. The Ward family would be closely watched. One wrong move, and it was over. And so, having endured the longest night of their lives, Chris Ward and Kevin McMullen put on their suits and made their way to work, as if nothing had happened at all. The only thought ringing through their minds was that if they didn't follow orders, their families would die. When the two men arrived at the Northern Bank headquarters that Monday morning, it was around 9 a.m. Both were doing everything they could to appear calm, giving their colleagues the impression that it was just another ordinary day. But internally, both men were still living the nightmare of the night before. As mentioned, both worked in the basement cash vault area of the bank, and they each carried the mobile phones the gang had given them. The robbers would use those phones to communicate with them throughout the day. The first instruction was to find a way to send the other staff home early. Kevin found some excuse in the afternoon and told his co-workers something along the lines of, "You've done enough for today. Head home and get a head start on your holiday preparations. We'll take care of the rest." With the relaxed atmosphere of Christmas week, nobody found it strange at all. Most people were happy to leave a little early, and only routine tasks remained. By around 6 p.m., the bank had closed its doors to customers, and only Chris Ward, Kevin McMullen, and the security guards remained inside. And that's when it truly began. Before going after the big score, the gang planned a small test run first. Following instructions, Chris Ward took a sports bag stuffed with cash, approximately £1 million, and casually walked out of the bank, telling security he'd be right back. He then walked quickly into a dark side street next to the building and approached a gang member waiting at the corner. He handed over the bag, £1 million, the equivalent of roughly $2 million, and walked back. The whole thing took just a few minutes, but for the gang, it was a critical test. If police or security had grown suspicious and intervened during that exchange, the plan would have been called off entirely. But Ward's brief absence raised no alarm whatsoever. Everything was going smoothly, and the main event could now begin. Around 7 p.m., the basement cash vault was entirely under the control of Ward and McMullen. Following instructions relayed through the phones, the two men got to work. They began pulling hundreds of thousands of banknotes out of the vault and packing them into solid containers and crates. The bank held cash collected from regional branches as well as freshly printed notes, which is why there was such a staggering amount of money inside. And because both employees were fully authorized to handle the vault, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They loaded the filled containers onto wheeled trolleys to transport them to the rear loading bay, where the bank's distribution trucks usually came and went. To avoid drawing attention from the security guards, they covered the money containers with old filing boxes, document folders, and a few office chairs, making it look like they were clearing out unwanted junk before the holidays. The guards assumed it was just a bit of pre-Christmas tidying up and thought nothing of it. Then came the critical moment in the plan. A white minibus pulled up to the rear loading bay at the back of the building, a vehicle the gang had sourced and fitted with fake license plates for that evening. Ward and McMullen told security it was there to collect rubbish, and got the back door opened. The robber's vehicle was now inside the bank's property without a single obstacle. All that was left was for the two employees to load the rubbish into the van. For 15 straight minutes, cash-filled containers were carried out one after another. The first batch alone filled 4 large trolleys, with the broken chairs and miscellaneous junk placed on top to keep suspicion away. The gang members stayed out of sight as much as possible throughout the process. By around 7:15 p.m., the minibus pulled away from the bank's rear exit with its first load, a colossal sum of money sliding quietly into the night. As the driver hit the accelerator and disappeared into the dark streets, the gang relayed fresh instructions to the two employees. Keep going. There were still millions left in the vault, and they intended to take as much as possible. Ward and McMullen continued filling more containers, again disguised under junk, and had them ready for collection. About 30 to 40 minutes later, the same white minibus returned to the back of the bank for a second pickup. Same scenario, same cover story. They loaded it until there was no space left. and at around 8 p.m., when the minibus pulled away from the northern bank's rear exit for the last time, it was done. In a single evening, more than $50 million had vanished from the Belfast Northern Bank. One of the easiest heists in history was complete. As flawless as the robbery seemed, there was one small moment of chance that almost brought the whole thing crashing down. When the minibus came back for the second load, a couple returning from shopping in a nearby street noticed two people acting strangely around the vehicle and grew suspicious. At 8:13 p.m., one of them reported the situation to a traffic warden in the area, and a patrol unit was immediately dispatched to the scene. But when officers arrived at the bank's rear exit at 8:18 p.m., just 5 minutes later, they found nothing. That few-minute delay had changed everything. The robbers had already taken the second load and vanished. The police were left looking at a dark, closed building with no sign of anything unusual. Back inside the bank, Chris and Kevin, exhausted and in a state of shock, did what they always did at the end of the day. They set the alarm systems and locked the doors, just like any other night. The only thing on their minds was getting to their families. Both men left the building as if they had simply completed a normal shift, like any ordinary employees walking out at the end of a workday. Around 9 p.m., Chris and Kevin made their way to the house where Chris's family had been held throughout the night. When they arrived, the two masked gunmen were still there, but the fact that the bank workers had returned meant the plan had worked. It was time for them to leave. Before they did, however, they carried out a thorough cleanup to ensure they left behind no trace. They wiped down every surface they had touched, eliminated any possible fingerprints, and even took the teacups they had used. No evidence, no trail. They slipped out into the darkness and disappeared. But even as they left, there was still one unresolved loose end. Karen McMullen was still missing. Her release would take a few more hours. Once everything had been secured on the gang's end, one of them drove Karen, still blindfolded, to a remote woodland area. Then, around 11 p.m., following whatever signal had been given, the gang member left the young woman alone in the forest, blindfolded in pitch darkness, in the freezing cold, and drove away. They also set fire to Karen's car nearby, destroying any remaining evidence it might have held. Everything had been executed with meticulous precision. Karen eventually pulled off her blindfold and stumbled through the dark forest, shivering. When she spotted the lights of a few houses in the distance, she made her way toward them and found shelter. She became the first person to alert the outside world to what had happened that night, and she was rushed to hospital. By 11:45 p.m., bank officials and detectives had arrived at the scene and sealed the area. The scale of what had taken place was already becoming clear. A full accounting of the stolen money was carried out, and the total was staggering. 26.5 million pounds in cash had disappeared from the vault. Of that, 16.5 million was in freshly printed Northern Bank notes that had never been put into circulation. Another 5.5 million consisted of used notes collected from the bank's customers, and a further 4.5 million was in foreign currency from other banks and countries. Bank management immediately activated their crisis protocol and released the serial numbers of the stolen, freshly printed notes to the public, announcing that those specific banknotes would be withdrawn from circulation and rendered invalid. This made the 16.5 million in new notes nearly impossible to launder. However, the remaining 10 million pounds was completely untraceable and could be spent freely. Moving that volume of cash in a single evening was also, from a purely logistical standpoint, a remarkable achievement, but it immediately raised another question that would haunt investigators for months to come. Where were they hiding it all, and how were they planning to launder it? Unfortunately, and frustratingly, that question was never truly answered. To this day, nobody has been held responsible for this robbery. Nobody has been caught. A dedicated team of 50 detectives was assembled, and a wide-scale investigation was launched, but not a single lead was ever found. Not even the 16.5 million in traceable, serial-numbered notes has ever surfaced, at least not in any way that led to an arrest. Estimates of the gang's size varied. Some said 30 people, others said 10. But the general consensus among investigators was that a heist carried out with this level of military discipline could not have been the work of just a handful of amateurs. 1 year after the robbery, £50,000 in banknotes that matched the bank's records was found in the toilets of a police social club in Belfast. How did it get there? Was someone inside the police involved? That question was never answered either. Even more intriguing was the arrest of Chris Ward, one of the victims, 11 months after the robbery. The reasoning behind it was a small but suspicious detail. Records showed that under normal circumstances, Chris should have been on leave the day the robbery took place, but just a few days beforehand, he had swapped his day off with a colleague and come into work on the very day everything went wrong. This tiny detail, only noticed 11 months later, was enough to get him arrested and have his home thoroughly searched. But after a few days of investigation, authorities concluded it had been a coincidence, and he was released. Ward was never formally charged, prosecuted, or convicted of anything, and that, in a strange and unsatisfying way, is where the story ends. 2 cars full of cash, money found in a police facility, a victim who was briefly a suspect, accusations that the investigation was mishandled, and yet over $50 million disappeared in the span of an hour, and nobody has ever been brought to justice for it.